postgraduate seminar. I'm Tom Boyd. I'm a PhD student at Manchester in the Department of Social Anthropology. And for those that have come before, would have already heard, but we're a group of several postgraduate students in the Department of Social Anthropology at Manchester who wanted to create a seminar series where kind of early career researchers or early career anthropologists could present their exciting new work. So that's what we hope we've created a platform to do that. So yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording the seminar. So yeah, if you don't want to be kind of featured in that recording, just keep your video off, and that should be fine. I think we're looking at maybe like a 40-minute presentation, and then some time for a Q&A afterwards. So yeah, so we're really lucky to have Dr. Ian Cook with us today. Ian Cook is a research fellow at the Central European University in Budapest, an anthropologist with a regional focus on South India. He works primarily on cities, new media, and doing academia differently. He has published work on topics including small cities, housing, vigilantism, and land. He's keen to open up universities, which he does hopefully by both making academic podcasts, I think that's what we're going to hear more about, and teaching others how to make them, and as part of an access program for refugees and asylum seekers. He likes to work with sounds, images, and texts. His current research projects include urban change in Mangaluru in India, academic podcasting, corruption and environmental damage in Hungary, digital media, and urban justice in Europe. At CEU, he currently works at the Center for Media, Data and Society, Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy, and Olive. And today he'll be speaking on academic podcasting, an insurgent, curious craft. But just before we get started, Ian, I wondered if you could just tell us where you are, just kind of describe where you are a little bit, and then if you could go into your presentation. Thanks very much.
Sure, thank you so much. So now I am sitting in my home in Budapest, not in the university. We have this strange, very empty university because we're not allowed any students in there. Sort of eerie. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was very happy to accept, and the other talks looked really interesting as well. So I think it's a really great initiative. And I was thinking about today and also about how much time we all spend on Zoom. And so I'm going to try a different type of presentation, which about the research, which I hope works well. But for that, I will need a little bit more audience interaction than is usually required from all these Zoom seminars that happens these days. So we'll require some active listening on everybody's part, and a little bit less looking at my face on a Zoom screen, which is probably best for everyone. So, as Tom mentioned, I'll be talking about academic podcasting today. So I started this research project directly after my PhD. So it was my PhD research was on urban change in India. So I did lots of research with housing and land brokers, with door-to-door salespeople, and with auto rickshaw drivers. And I think, like many people, once they finished their PhD, was looking to do something a little bit different, just as a sort of almost like a palate cleanser. I thought, oh yeah, it'd be fun to do something with podcasting for a little while. But then it sort of took on a life of its own, and it became a 2-year postdoc, and then this research project, and it'll be forthcoming in a book. At least I hope it will. I missed the deadline quite spectacularly with the publishers, but hopefully, conditions will allow me to get out of that. And so today I'm gonna make part of the case for the idea that scholarly or academic podcasting is, as the title suggests, an insurgent, curious craft. And I'm gonna make this argument based on interviews with around 100 podcasting academics, including scholars and teachers of podcasting. And I also listened to at least 3 of each episodes of every podcast in the series of people I spoke with, if I could understand the language. And I also drew on my own experience as a podcaster, as a teacher, and as a co-founder of a university-based podcasting initiative. And when I was doing the research, I was pushed a lot to think about academic knowledge production, especially scholarly writing norms and scholarly presentation norms, and what I could possibly learn from academic podcasting. And so at some point when I was writing the book, I decided to remove nearly all of my own words and rather place the rich, I think, articulate and reflexive thoughts of the podcasters front and center. And as you can imagine, because they are podcasters, many of them know how to speak very well. And so these interviews that I did, they've been transcribed, analyzed, and then curated in a way that I hope makes the argument in a more subtle, caveated, and multifaceted, and hopefully productively contradictory fashion. So the sort of the theorization, the reading that I did to both inform the research design and the analysis sort of lays more gently at the background. I think I'd say a more thorough theorization, maybe for a literature review and all that sort of stuff, can be used in a more suitable outlet. But I think neither this presentation nor this book, but of course I'm happy to talk about it. And I realized that this choice basically of curating my interlocutors' words and remove myself a lot will not please everyone. And of course, it's possible to make many arguments for standard academic writing. That's probably why it exists. But when I was reflecting on what I love about good podcasts and good academic podcasts, I realized that it was their contingency, their vulnerability, their experimentation that I really liked. So I decided to let the content suggest a different form for this research. And I've also noticed in myself, I don't know how all of you feel, but like the sort of combination of the speed reading of academic texts that we do for often very narrow purposes, just to extract something we need for something else. Very often, and also actually the skim reading we do when it comes to digital media, like we just read stuff really fast. I think it's made me a much worse reader than I used to be. I skip over the long quotes and I jump to the end of articles, and I think I've really started to miss the immersion that I got from reading really good text. However, at the same time, the last sort of 5-6 years when I've been really deep diving into scholarly podcasting and other forms of podcasting, I think I've become a much better listener. Because I've been forced to do so. If you make podcasts, you're forced to be a good listener because you have to listen to people all the time, like when we do research interviews as well. So in what's going to follow in this presentation, you're going to be listening to the excerpts from interviews, and that's pretty much all there's going to be. So you will have to listen to that and hopefully take notes, and then we can have a discussion based on that. And hopefully this will allow you to engage with the research in a thoughtful and appreciative manner. So what did I want to do with this research project before we listen? So I set out to find out why, what, and how academics podcast, or the how, what's, and whys of academic podcasting. So in regards to why, and I'm going to talk about this more in a short while, I'm arguing for many because they see it as an insurgent practice in regards to standard academia. In regards to what, which unfortunately we won't have time to talk about today, I argue that for many academic podcasts are curiosity generators. So this is a curiosity engendered practice that allows scholars to follow their interests. It remediates knowledge as it circulates and can even create knowledge. So academics can follow their interests through different questions, conversations, and stories. It's remediated as it draws on the affordances of digital and sonic media. And academic podcasting can also be data creation, as knowledge creation, either through data collection or as a method analysis. And there is also increasingly a number of peer-reviewed podcasts. And finally, I argue, and I won't talk about today, but that academic podcasting is a craft. It needs a serious appreciation of the medium and what it can do. It's not simply just reading an academic text and putting it online. It needs some serious engagement and thought, and thinking about structure and potential audiences, how we write, how we speak, how we record and edit, and so on. So today, though, I'm going to talk just about one aspect of this, which is the why, and not even all of the why, just one part of this argument about insurgency. And I argue that it's an insurgent practice because it can transform knowledge production in a creative fashion. And this is what I'm going to focus on, actually, the creativity here. So we can alter the contours of doing academia for the better, and it can facilitate rich, diverse, and open communication. Of course, there's no guarantee that academic podcasting will be insurgent, transformative, or even good. There are plenty of really terrible scholarly podcasts out there that just regurgitate structures of academic privilege and prestige, turn a text into audio with no thought of the medium. And I think sometimes they're made to fill people's CVs rather than to fill listeners' ears. But I think part of the insurgency lies, right now at least, in how it can't be held. So it doesn't find its legitimacy from fitting into pre-existing categories of knowledge and validation. And I think this is quite empowering because it allows the academic podcaster, at least for the moment, to create their own knowledge world, and in a way our own way of making that knowledge world to come real. So it reverses the legitimacy, which, if we were able to fully embrace it, would hopefully allow us to break away from the assumption, and I say this because I'm speaking as an early career researcher to mostly PhD students, I imagine, this assumption that we have careers on linear paths to secure jobs where personal development, economic stability, and knowledge progress, all these things structure what's acceptable and unacceptable academic practice. I think by allowing alternative forms of knowledge production, dissemination, and validation to circulate, we could break free from some of these assumptions and embrace the possibility of multiple potential futures in which academic knowledge production and dissemination could be something yet unknown. We can build our own realities, our own knowledge world-making practices, in which podcast and other emerging media are central to the making of those realities. And so about creativity, which is what you're going to listen to excerpts from right now. So I think creativity emerges from the freedom to do something different, as you might imagine, within the often stifling structures of academic life. I think it emerges from the vulnerability found through on-air, open intellectual inquiry. And I think it emerges when intimacy reworks traditional ideas of authority and trust in the works that scholars produce. I'm going to stop speaking now, as I promised not to speak too much. And I've prepared for everybody, and I'm going to put it in the chat, a 28-minute sound collage. It's not the most perfectly edited thing ever, because I've not done work on many of the elements of audio that I usually would do, because I'm still moving it around and I've not decided how to finish it. But I'm going to ask you all to listen. No need to keep your cameras on, but please actually listen. So that means don't check emails, don't look at social media. You can walk around if you want and do physical stuff, but don't get distracted by words or text anywhere, because then you won't really be able to appreciate the words of the people I interviewed. So I put the link in the chat now, and now it's, let's say, 17 minutes past, let's say 20 past. So like 48 minutes past, okay, I should say 45. So at 4:45 UK time and 5:45 Central European time, I'll turn back on my camera, and then hopefully we can have a discussion based on what you've learned from this curation of interviews. Okay, okay, I'm going to put the link again, just there, and I'll check Liam's link afterwards. Is that all right, Tom? Does that all make sense? Okay.
That sounds perfect. Great plan.
Okay, so enjoy the listening, everybody.
Yeah, Ian, people are struggling to access the link.
1 second, I'll fix it.
Yeah.
Should work now. Does it work? Okay, great. Thank you very much, and see you all in 28 minutes. Okay, whenever you've done listening, please turn on your camera so that I know that
yeah.
you're done.
Sorry.
Okay, some people sent to me private messages as well. Hope you enjoyed that listening process. As you can tell, some academic podcasters are better at recording than others, and I haven't yet leveled out all of the different volume. You were listening in order to Bonnie Statuick from Teaching in Higher Ed, Benjamin Thompson from the Nature Podcast, Simon Theobald from The Familiar Strange, Blair Hodges from the Maxwell Institute, Claire Wright from Archive Fever, again, Blair Hodges from the Maxwell Institute, Alwyn Erwitt, who is a podcast scholar, Martin Spinelli, who is also a podcast scholar and podcaster, Moritz Klenk from Podlog, Maria Tseri from In Theory, Kevin Knudsen from My Favorite Theorem, Hannah McGregor from Secret Feminist Agenda, Marie Tseri again from In Theory, Dumi Holdish, podcast practitioner and Down But Not Out, Christine Yao from PH Divas podcast, Liz Wayne from PH Divas podcast, Laurie Beckstead, a podcast scholar, Samuel M. Clevenger from the Somatic podcast, Brian Fry from Ipsy Dixit, Michael LaBelle from Energy and Innovation, Michael Cox from Finding Sustainability Project, and finally again, Martin Spinelli, podcast scholar. And now I'd like to ask you to start the discussion, like comments, feedback, thoughts. Pass it over to Tom actually as chair.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was really interesting and kind of still allowing that to kind of wash over me. But yeah, just to get things going, I'll kind of maybe make a comment and a question, and then let's open it up to everybody else afterwards. Yeah, it was so striking kind of in the first few clips, this sense of intimacy that's being offered through the medium of podcasts. So this sense of, you know, people, I think more than one person said that you can speak kind of directly into people's ears, and this kind of like highly personal form of, well, communication, I guess. You know, so that was really, really striking. But also this kind of like pervasive uneasiness with kind of current practices of academic knowledge production, like principally to do with text and written papers and publications, and that actually podcasts kind of allowed another means of people doing or discussing research that wasn't kind of indisputable, it wasn't closed, it wasn't definite, there wasn't a finality. I think someone mentioned like a hostile environment. So there was kind of this, I think people seem to want to embrace like the open-endedness. And whilst it's no less rigorous, it's like there's a vulnerability and it invites like dialogue and conversation. I think the question that comes to mind is, so maybe in the making of the podcast that kind of there's this open-endedness that allows this like dialogue and conversation. Like, what happens after an episode's produced? Like, what I'm kind of really curious about the listener, and you know, where does the conversation go? Like, does it often end? So I think obviously we've been looking at people that are making them, but I'm wanting to bring the listener in and like hear about that side in regards to a conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So this is one part that I didn't present, which was more about the communicating, and thank you very much. It's obviously like a key part, and I think there's and again, it comes down to the question of who your audience is. So for some of these academic podcasters, you heard in this section from Michael Cox from Finding Sustainability, and within their podcast, they very specifically realized they were making a podcast for people within the realm of sustainability studies. And at first they were like, oh, we should have a wider public. Then they were like, actually, you know what, maybe we don't need a wider public. Actually, maybe it's about creating a community of scholars who are working on a certain topic. And maybe only 500 to 1,000 people will ever listen to this podcast, but that's fine, because those are the 500 to 1,000 people who are working on a particular aspect of sustainability, you know, and it allowed them to help create this community and to share ongoing research. You know, we all know the story of academic publishing and the long running times. It can be years before a journal article comes out, and sometimes you want to share those ideas earlier and put them into conversation earlier. I interviewed the two makers of the Nature podcast, you know, for the Nature Journal, and one you heard from then, but the other person I spoke to from the journal, Neil, I forgot his last name, but he said he made a point that maybe in the past, you know, what did scientists used to do 200 years ago? They would write letters to each other about their latest research. Why can't we, you know, make podcasts and then create this community of sharing this sort of knowledge as well, you know? So that was that. So that's like one group of people, the scholars. The other one is like when it's like for a wider audience, and it really depended on the podcast. And I think this is like quite interesting. So I spoke with Chris Smith, who is calls himself the Naked Scientist in the UK. You'll hear him also on the radio, and he was doing podcasts before podcasts were even a thing. You know, he was just putting stuff online and allowing people to download it. And he has a massive numbers of people listening and getting in touch. And it's interesting because he says, you know, like in the past, there was always this assumption that okay, there would, if you can put a little bit of science into a mainstream show, then, you know, you could sort of how sneak the science in, you know, and people would take it. But then it turns out actually there's a massive audience for science, you know, of all forms. Like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people actually want to listen to scientists discuss their research, and but it's never existed in a radio format. It was never given the slot. But podcasting allows any sort of audience to emerge because it's subscribable and downloadable and can be listened to any time and any place. So niche audiences and even larger audiences can emerge there. And then once you get a large enough audience, then you do start to get this feedback. But most of the podcasts I spoke to who had smaller podcasts were expecting more audience interaction than what they got. They were asking for people to write in or this and that. And if they were getting around 1,000, 2,000 listeners, which is sort of good for a niche academic podcast, they were surprised that we didn't really get people actually engaging. And I think that's partly to do with the nature of podcasting being a digital media, but not one that invites instant interaction. So it's not like, you know, you see a post and you write about it straight away, but actually you listen and then afterwards, then if you remember when you get home, because you were listening when you were at the gym or you were listening when you're walking your dog, then you remember to write, but often you don't, right? Because it's like, you know, you just remembered it at that time. So that sort of listenership was low. So that was in terms of communication. I hope I answered that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was interesting. And so yeah, I should have said before, if anyone wants to ask a question, make a comment, just raise your hand or put it in the chat, or just feel free to speak. So I'll kind of open it up to everybody if anyone has a question. Claudia.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is a very brief question, but first of all, thanks for the podcast, or the quotes from the podcast. It was really, really interesting to listen to and very nicely put together. I was wondering if this notion of trust is really, like, is it the medium as such that facilitates this kind of sense of trust? Or like, what about the podcaster and like what role do the people play that do the interview and that are the interlocutors, and what is the medium as such as a facilitator or a means of providing trust? That's my question.
So you mean, is it the actual podcasters or is it the medium?
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, you need both, right? But I think there's something about, but it's, as was mentioned at the very beginning in terms of intimacy. So there's two things. I think one is the first one is about intimacy, and that's like they said, and it's talked about a lot in the small but growing field of podcast studies, that, you know, it's in your ear and you make an active choice to subscribe to it, which is different than if it's on the radio and it's just on, right? So you've subscribed and so you've chosen. Once you've done that, then podcast a series, right? So you build up a relationship with people over time, and so you get to know the familiarity of the person's voice and of the particular podcasters, and so the trust then emerges through this relationship over time with repeated engagement, and also I think because of the intimacy as well. So it's the two things. So like one, I don't think you have the same intimacy unless you're a really good writer. Very often you don't really have the same intimacy in a textual form, because there's, but go for it. I can see you're on the spotlight, so let's have a discussion rather than me just talking and answering. Go on. I thought you were going to say something, Claudia. I was reading your face.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, just as a follow-up question, like, how much did it, like, now since we're doing most of these things online, not sharing the same kind of small space in which you conduct these conversations, like, how important did you feel was this kind of physical proximity and the room that you share for the period of the for the recording and for the kind of the atmosphere that it creates and the trust that can be built, and how different that is that if you only have the voice in your ear and not like the person in front of you.
Yeah, so if you're talking about the making, when it comes to making, like myself and I think most of the podcasters use a video at the time, and that's because, for exactly now, when I saw you wanted to come back and I can read your face, then we can easily have a conversation than if it's just audio. But I would say, and this directly relates to how we think about structures of online learning, that actually having less there is better, which is why I asked everyone to turn off the screen and just listen. So I personally think that teaching through Zoom is a problem for many reasons, but it's just too distracting, to be quite frank. I can see myself, I can see you, I can see however many other people, and also, you know, things can pop up on your computer even if you think you've turned everything off. That's not so great, I think, for deep immersive engagement with any sort of topic. But a podcast, even if you're doing something else, that usually people listen to podcasts, often people listen to podcasts when they are doing something boring. That's why I mentioned, you know, unpacking the dishwasher or whatever. But then the podcast itself becomes the distraction. And of course, you're doing this rather mundane task, but that doesn't mean you can't concentrate on what's actually being said. You actually concentrate quite well. And it goes all the way back to to ancient Greek philosophy and this idea of sound which is seen and not heard, and why was it Pythagoras who used to do his lectures behind a veil, like behind a screen, because he wanted basically people only to listen to the voice and not pay attention to him and who he was. And what this does is it creates, you know, certain sonic images in your head of the person, which is also why it's also interesting when we see people who we know that only their voice of. Often we're disappointed because, you know, we expected them to look somehow different because we've created that image of them in our heads. And I think this is also a type of intimacy, and intimacy and vulnerability creates trust once you stick with somebody. So and of course I'm talking now about people who do podcasts well. Of course there are plenty of people who create bad podcasts which don't generate any sort of trust or vulnerability or intimacy.
Tom, can I go? Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think Pedro also had his hand, I think, just so you know.
Yeah, right. Tom, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Vlad, do you want to
Right.
ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, because my question actually builds up a little bit on the comment that Liam posted on the chat, which is very much about the idea of Liam printing, and he says, well, the podcast that his company makes, none of them have become self-financing, and he says, I know no one has mentioned this, but trust me, you'll get sick of doing podcasts for free. And my question actually relates to that, because when you say podcasts are a craft, I would ask you, are they a craft or are they a hobby? And is there a difference?
So in first part, I would say one of the things that's quite liberating about making an academic podcast is that no one expects to make any money from it. You know, the same way you don't make any money from publishing other forms of publishing in academia, unless for some reason you write an amazingly top-selling book, you know. But I can tell you, I don't know how many people here have book deals. Like I have 2 for 2 different projects, and I get royalties of 7.5% and 6%, you know. Like, I mean, like, you know, I'd have to sell a few million copies to get rich. So this is how podcasting, this is how, you know, publishing works. People do get paid for making podcasts. I have been paid for making academic podcasts because people have research projects. So I made one for a couple of years called Online Gods on Digital Media in India. And then the principal investigator of the research project asked me, oh, could you come make a podcast as part of the project? And I said, probably with the same sort of idea in mind that Liam had, I said, okay, but it's a lot of work, you know, like I'm not going to do it as like whatever, and it's not my main area of research. So if you want me to do it, I'll do it, but for a job. And they said, okay. And then they pay me to do it for a year and a half. And so there is something there. What's the difference between a hobby and a craft? I don't think all crafts have to be paid for it to make it a craft. Rather, what I was getting at with craft is that is that the podcasters who do things, I think, that who make good academic podcasts, they've done them in a way where they've really thought seriously about the medium and the affordances of sound and the affordances of digital media as well, in terms of how they structure, in terms of how they try to convey ideas through sound, emotion, inflections of voice, and so on and so forth, and how they spent time thinking about how they speak, how they read, how they write, and all of these matters. And that's where for me the craft comes in, rather than it being paid or not paid. But there are, like, you know, there are ways to get paid doing academic podcasting as well. I see 2 hands, one from Pedro, one from Naomi, and there's also a question in the chat. So maybe I should
Pedro, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think my question is about time management in making scholarly podcasts, because, well, I am currently a student working in Mundarel podcast in Anthropology here in Brazil. And while we were making one of our episodes, I showed to my father, and the first thing he said was, it's too long. I can't listen for something for too long. And this is not only an obstacle we face within making the podcast, but also I think in academia as a whole. Sometimes we make these too long articles and we have to edit, or have to comply with some 15 pages to send them. So what are things we can think about? What are some of the techniques we have to think about to make a scholarly podcast and manage the time? I know we can make it like podcasts about 90 minutes, but it's kind of too long sometimes.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one there's no direct answer for. First, I'm going to share with you what I think sounds like an interesting. Do you know this podcast? This is a Brazilian anthropology podcast. I also interviewed the maker of that, Soria, and I think it's an interesting idea, which I'm just going to mention to everybody now, because we're in a room full of anthropologists, where the idea of that podcast was to bring together the anthropologist with one of the interlocutors for an interview, and that was how the podcast made. So after the research was published somewhere, then they would come and have a discussion about it. And I think it was an interesting concept. I can't understand it because I don't speak Portuguese. But yeah, so how long should a podcast be? So one of the most popular history podcasts, which isn't made by an academic, but is made by someone, I think they have an MA in history, and then they went on to be a talk show host. It's called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and it's quite sensational type history in a sense, because he's only talking about the more exciting parts of history, you know, battles, wars, death, and so on. He makes podcasts which are 3 to 4 hours long, and it's one of the most popular podcasts in the world. So yeah, and that's because I think with a podcasting form, people don't mind the deep dive. People really don't mind like getting really into stuff. I also interviewed a couple of people from a podcast called Big Biology, and they used to make 2 versions of their podcast. They used to make a short version for the general public and a longer version for fellow biologists or so on. And the longer version got way more downloads than the shorter version. Now, this may be for 2 reasons. It may be because people are more interested in the longer form, or it may be that they just didn't have the skills to create properly crafted audio in a way that, you know, was really truly engaging. Now, if you listen to shows like Radiolab or 99% Invisible, these are taking intellectual themes and they're exploring them in a very tightly produced, tightly edited format, but they have massive teams of people like to produce these. So if you want to go and get quotes from 10 different people, create a strong narrative, do a sound design, put that out, that's a lot of work. And it's also probably not realistic. When you first said time management, I thought you were going to ask a question about how long it takes to make a podcast. I'm also going to put in the chat just a quote from the guy you heard before from what was he called? The Maxwell Institute podcast, which was the one he was talking about secularism. And he was talking about, the secular Jewish guy who was talking about his father who died, and it's actually a Mormon podcast, but a more scholarly Mormon podcast. But he says it takes him 20 hours to make a podcast, which is an interview about a book. You can have his full breakdown there of how long it takes him. And so, like, realistically, if you're just going to read a book and then interview someone about it, he would suggest that's 20 hours of work. Suggest it might be more depending on how quickly you can read a book. So my long-winded way of telling you was the podcast can be as long or short as you want it to be. Sometimes making a shorter podcast is way more work than making a longer podcast, but it depends on who your audience is. So if your audience is your dad, which is totally fine, like, or somebody like your dad, and your dad doesn't want to listen to something of more than half an hour, then try to make half-hour podcasts, and then you'll make all those decisions when you're putting together your podcast in terms of like how long you need your interviews to be, and so on and so forth.
Okay, great. We've got a question in the chat from Elena. So you mentioned that there are some peer-reviewed podcasts emerging. How does it work? And do you think it can potentially legitimize this type of medium for the scholarly community so that it does not look like just doing fun things online that early career researchers cannot necessarily afford at expense of publishing in top journals?
It's a great question. So the one podcast and another podcast are not the same, in the same way that 2 bits of writing aren't the same, right? So an article that we put into a journal is not the same as a blog post, is not the same as a book, is not the same as a chapter, is not the same as whatever else. And this is one of the problems right now, is that there needs to be some sort of recognition of this, basically. So it gets properly counted and properly seen as a legitimate form of work. I think there's a tension here, and the tension is, on the one hand, because it isn't yet properly codified and controlled by management structures, there's a lot of freedom there, you know, to do what you want, and there's not any manager breathing down anyone's neck trying to do this, that, and so on, and there's not people doing it just for the sake of doing it, which is what so many people are upset about in publishing. There's so many people just publish to get brownie points, to get a job, or to get a promotion or whatever. However, it's also at the same time, the problem is then the labor, the real and the intellectual academic work isn't being recognized. So certain systems have started to emerge. So what some people have just, started doing this sort of podcasting in a similar way to an article, in the sense it's produced, and it's something which is more like maybe audio doc style, it's gone through peer review and then changes have been made and then it's been put back out. And that's sort of a standard way, and maybe an obvious way, but it doesn't totally work so well for the discipline. Another, for the medium, sorry. Another way is like a post review podcast. So one of the people who we spoke with was, who you heard from then, is Hannah McGregor. And she does a podcast called Secret Feminist Agenda. And she has had 3 series of hers peer reviewed by press, by the Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And basically they organize the peer review. And this is basically, they have a series, I think of 10 or 20 episodes, and they invite 4 or 5 people in, and those 4 or 5 people then offer their review in audio form, and then she does a response to that. Now, this is, you know, gender studies or feminist scholarship, whatever, and this is, of course, very different than if you're doing different forms of scholarship, which it's more dialogical, so it really works well. The other question is, it's totally related to that. What about a podcast thesis or final work as a degree? Yes. So there's this one from the Podlog. We mentioned him before. We also heard from the German guy, where you were speaking to before. He did monologues to himself about the creation of knowledge and other things every day for a year, and then submitted that on a USB stick for his dissertation. Yeah, it's in the experimental humanities. I'm not sure we get away with that in anthropology, but that exists there. I think most universities, unfortunately, are not very good for multimodal anthropology. I had a problem trying to submit ethnographic films alongside my PhD. I know in Manchester you've got a strong tradition of visual anthropology, but we don't have that at Central European University. And my second supervisor basically wanted to stop it and said, no, it's not, you know. And we had a bit of an argument and so on. And she won. That's how hierarchy works, right? And so there are people trying this stuff. There was another one which I can't remember right now, but there are a few people basically submitting PhDs as in audio form. One of the interesting idea with peer review, which is being worked out, is the idea that you could use a podcast as a pre-peer review to have a discussion with a peer reviewer. So let's say I've got an article that's being formed, and then I said, okay, then before I submit that to a journal, why don't we make a podcast episode when I have a discussion with somebody who might potentially be a peer reviewer. In the end, they won't be a peer reviewer, and then actually basically just a pre-peer review to discuss that thing, you know, online, which is then super helpful for you for developing through your ideas. And also, you know, it's like a publication of a serious scholarly work with a serious, you know, examination of that, and then it goes out. So there are a few different models emerging, and I think it's interesting because, you know, the fact that the idea that double blind peer review is the gold standard is a new thing. You know, it's only really existed since the 1970s that this is held up as the boilerplate idea of what constitutes a decent review. And I'm sure we all know, because when you become an expert in something, like we all do when we do PhDs, then you read stuff and you're like, that's not right, you know, and like, how did that get through peer review? How did that get published? You know, like there's something like either something really off with that ethnography or whatever, and yet you know, it happens. And so so I don't think we need to hold up like peer review as this as the current forms of textual peer review as this sort of gold standard. Yeah. That can't be changed.
Okay, Naomi, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you for all these thought-provoking comments you made. It's really really nice to hear and to think about. My questions is related to how podcasts are obviously and thankfully growing, and what I'm wondering specifically is what challenges will academic podcasters need to overcome in the near future? In terms of outreach to non-academics, for example, if that's the aim of the podcast, or academics, if that's the aim of the podcaster, in terms of financing, institution acceptance of the medium, all these kind of things. Yeah, what do you see the academic podcast in 5 years? I guess is my question, broadly. Thank you.
So it's a great question. So there's a bunch of challenges I see. Then firstly is there's too many people making podcasts, so it's hard to find an audience. Like years ago, there wasn't that many, and it was easier, much easier to get an audience. Now everybody seems to decide to want to make a podcast, and there's just not enough people to listen to them. So if your goal is to find an audience, it's quite difficult. Especially as even if you could make, and this works for both non-academic podcasts and academic podcasts, you could make a brilliant podcast, but if a celebrity or a celebrity academic comes along and makes a podcast, more people are going to listen to that just because they have a name. And that's unfortunately the way that, that it works. More generally, podcasting used to be very open, like it's done from the RSS feed, and which is open, but now it's starting to be closed by Spotify, and Apple have followed Spotify to basically have content which is only exclusively available on certain platforms. We've not seen that yet in academic podcasting because there's no money there, but if the open access drive doesn't continue in academic publishing, and some scholarly journals decide to take academic podcasting more seriously, then they also might start to put their podcast behind paywalls, which I think would also be problematic and against what excites me about podcasts. In terms of institutions, it's really hard work. So we struggled at our university because we had a provost who just did not understand, just did not understand what they were doing, and then in other universities, they've had really supportive provosts or vice chancellors or so on who really got it, because you basically need not so much money. You can build, if there's a little room somewhere in a university for like, a couple of £1,000, you could build a professional sounding podcast studio with decent mics, recorder and everything, and some audio treatment on the walls. You don't necessarily have to have it as soundproof. But then institutions have to work out what to do with them if they want to really support it. So one problem that people have spoken about is that sometimes communication teams want to take it over because they see it as communication. And what I would say, and other academic scholars would say, no, this is a form of scholarly publication. It's not promotion of the university. It's not like, those cheesy promotional videos they also make. It's scholarship. So, have to defend it as scholarship and not as a job for the communications or PR department of a university. And also that means that if we're going to have people teaching podcasting, which I think is something we should do, like the same way we teach ourselves, anthropological filmmaking and so on, that again, it should be done by people who also understand the discipline or social sciences more broadly or whatever, and not just people who are great technicians, because that's only one part of it, but also about, the translation of intellectual ideas into different medium. I think I answered all your questions. Am I right, Naomi?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes.
If I can just add a comment here, because I went to that I can never say that, the Royal Anthropological Institute thing. There was a seminar yesterday. They interviewed Gillian Tett, she's a Financial Times advisor who did her PhD in social anthropology. And she just published a book called Why the World Needs Anthropologists, and it's very much for business people, and she advocates for the use of anthropology in every single sphere of business because they can only benefit. And so I think that seminar will be published on the Royal Anthropological Institute YouTube channel soonish, like within next week, I think. So if you want to take a look, it was super interesting. But at the end of her talk, she mentions podcasts are as a useful way for anthropologists to advertise the benefits of anthropology and what we can do to better the world. But she says that the anthropologist in that situation needs to make an ethical choice on what to edit, because you can't do, and you talked about this earlier, you can't do the long piece. That's not going to interest anybody, especially not business people. They want short and they want their money back guaranteed kind of way. So you need to kind of edit your discourse to be willing to make bullet points to come across and to use their language, the language of their tribe, to kind of get what you need to them and what they need to them too, I guess. But I thought that was an interesting comment in terms of podcasts and short kind of podcast specifically. So
Yeah,
that's
just a 10-second response to that. That is why whenever you make a podcast, I mean, one way of defining a podcast is through this technical definition, okay? Subscribable, online, audio, but actually it's about podcasting, is about relationship forming. And this is why also we talked about trust and intimacy and so on. And if you don't know who your audience is, then you're not going to make a good podcast. And so if you decide you'll make a podcast for business people as an anthropologist, then that's good because you know your audience. But the academic podcasts, which for me don't work very well, is the ones that don't know their audience before they start. You know, either they make this jovial, ha, let's be lighthearted, and only circulate it amongst their peers, and then people don't want to listen to it because they find it too flaky, or they send too dense stuff out to everybody, and then people wonder why people can't understand them when they're talking about the ontological turn or whatever the fuck. Yeah.
right. Thank you.
All right, we've got another question in the chat from Majdi. My question is about sources, so written or audio or any other formats that can guide me through the first steps of starting podcasts. So a question about recommendations, I guess, for getting started.
I mean, there's a million, yeah, I don't know, there's a million, I don't know. Like, to be honest, they're all, I mean, to be honest, I would say just start doing it. Most important thing to think about is not to get too worried about the technical side, but rather to think about how you're going to translate that knowledge into how you're going to translate intellectual academic knowledge into the audio form. That's the big challenge. So it's if there's stuff about editing and recording and so on, you can find a million things out there. Like there's a million channels, and I don't have one to recommend, I'm sorry, because I can't remember. I've been years ago since I looked to them myself. So you should buy my book when it comes out, Academic Podcasting, What, Why, How.
All right, then. I think we have, I can't see any other questions, but we have time for one more if there's anyone.
Could I ask a question?
Oh,
Hello?
sure.
Hi, and thanks for the invite. So I find it really exciting, this potential of podcasting for targeting specific public, perhaps even for shaping particular counter publics or whatever. I was thinking, like, how does one reach their public? I know there's no recipe, no blueprint path to the public, but perhaps some practical tips. For instance, let's say my envisioned public will be early career art workers, and then I've made a podcast. Then what? Practically speaking, I'm uploading it to, I don't know. I just haven't thought about it, and it strikes me that there must be some practical steps as well.
Yeah, so if you're making a podcast for a micro audience, for a niche audience, then you're one of those people, then you probably know how information is usually circulated in that community. So when I was making a media anthropology podcast, there's a list for media anthropologists, and it was circulated on that all the time. And that's probably where most of the listeners came from. Likewise, if you go to specific conferences or specific events in the real world, once they exist, then those are the places to do it. More broadly than that, then it gets much more difficult. You have to really think about Google rankings and all this sort of stuff, but I don't think we're in that sort of realm when it comes to that. I mean, but yeah, I mean, if you want to get an audience, you have to be regular. People expect things to be done like regularly.
Thanks.
And I can see raised hands from Kamud. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm sorry I came a few minutes late, 5 minutes late, so I don't know if you've already covered this. But I'm starting a podcast series soon about gender-based work in Nepal. So it's a very specific one focused on research in Nepal. And I was wondering if you could say something about involving activists in podcasts aimed at academics, because there are a couple of them who I think would make for interesting guests. But is there something you could say about what I need to be aware of, or how to fit them into that series where other academics might be speaking? If you could say something about that.
I think it's a great idea to have non-academics and academics together in podcasts. I mentioned this Brazilian podcast before, which I think has an interesting idea. A podcast that this media anthropology podcast I mentioned, we used to do it called Online Gods. We used to do it in a way where we had first a 15-20 minute discussion with a scholar about a theme, and then second, a 20-minute discussion with an online god, as we called them, which was somebody who was using digital or new media in interesting or innovative ways. And I thought it was quite interesting in terms of having people circulate together, like afterwards, like, you know, in terms of sharing space. It can lead to problems in terms of your role as the podcaster and as an anthropologist, and how this is all balanced. And especially if you're doing something which could be politically controversial, which it might be in your case, and it was in our case. Sometimes, so for example, if I was interviewing like a right-wing Twitter superstar in India, then academics got upset when they heard this, because they said I was platforming this person and blah 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 blah, you know, and I was treating it as an anthropologist going in, making, you know, an interview. And, you know, so I was trying to understand this person's, you know, point of view, their life world, you know, what they thought about things. And then, of course, it's then circulates in a slightly different space, because then people were maybe expecting me to behave more like a journalist and challenge this person in a way that journalists usually would. I thought that was less interesting to do, because this happens all the time in the popular media, and I find it rather boring. I think it's maybe more interesting to try and really uncover the whys and the whats of why people do things. But that sort of points to the sort of two hats that you have to wear when you're making a podcast. One as an anthropologist, and then one also as a podcaster. And sometimes they don't have quite the same registers. So I would just be aware of that.
Okay, so I think we're kind of running out of time, but I think it's that time just to plug the next week's seminar, which is our final seminar of the series. So it'll be Dr. Matthew McMullen from Oxford speaking on pine marten, beaver, and the latent links, rewilding and the orientation of wild non-human labour. So that'll be our final seminar next week, same time and the same Zoom link and password. But yeah, just before we kind of finish and say thank you to Ian, I just wanted to ask you, is there anything, you know, that we should be looking forward to from you? You know, is there something that you're doing at the moment that you know, want to plug or just mention to us? I think you're muted.
Sorry, I am muted. I'm going to plug not something of my own. I'm just going to plug, maybe it's a website you already know, but I'm part of the editorial collective, and I think it's an interesting way of doing anthropology, which is Allegra. You also saw the link in the thing, so that's what I'm plugging. Allegra Lab, which is an interesting also way of thinking about academic knowledge for anthropologists and how we do stuff. So I'd rather promote that than anything of my own.
No, brilliant, wicked. That's grand. So yeah, that just like leaves us to thanks everyone for coming for today's seminar, and a special thank you to Ian. So thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Thank you so much, and sorry for somehow like stepping on your toes as a host at one point when I started pointing out. I just started behaving like a teacher, like I saw on the Zoom thing. So sorry about that.
No. Yeah, but yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, I'm going to delete that link because I don't have proper ethical clearance from everybody. So the sound thing, the audio files I will delete. But if you want to know the names of all the podcasters, then maybe it's just best to send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. So then people